Well, everybody, welcome to a special spring break edition of the Year Through the Bible podcast, where you have only me, your humble host, Andrew Forrest, senior pastor at Asbury Church. My colleague, Rodney Adams, is off and not with us today, so you're stuck with me. And I have some thoughts I want to share about the book of Numbers, which is a really weird book. Now, I got to tell you, one of the things that I struggle with a little bit with this Year Through the Bible format is how quickly we move through everything. So if you're just joining us, we're reading through the Bible in a year using the one-year Bible. Every day there's an Old Testament, a New Testament, a Psalm, and a proverb reading. And you do it through 365 days, you finish the Bible. So we move pretty quick. And so Numbers is just quick. But there is a lot in here that we haven't been able to talk about in other settings. So I want to talk today about Balaam, that really strange episode at the end of Numbers. So here's some thoughts real quick. First of all, remember the Torah, the first five books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, 5, and they all go together. Every book apart from Genesis begins with the word and. They're all telling a unified story. And there's this chiastic structure, fancy Bible word, where basically things like mirror each other. So Genesis and Deuteronomy are mirrored. Exodus and Numbers and Leviticus is at the center, and the high point of Leviticus is the Day of Atonement. Okay, why does this matter? Exodus begins with a foreign king who is afraid of the numerical might of the people, it says in Exodus chapter 1, verse 9. And Numbers ends with the king of Moab being afraid of the numerical might of the people we read in Numbers. And so he tries to hire this man named Balaam, son of Beor. Now here is what is so awesome, everybody. Balaam is actually mentioned outside of the Bible. Do you know how rare this is? I mean, people are always like, what evidence do we have for things in the Bible, outside the Bible? But part of the problem is this is really old stuff. We have basically nothing from the ancient world. We have the Bible and a few other things here and there. So to want all this evidence outside the Bible is an unrealistic desire. It doesn't exist, which is why when something does exist, it's amazing. So a number of decades ago now, it was sort of fashionable to say, King David didn't really exist. And then in Jerusalem, they have this rule in Israel that you can't build and dig without hiring the antiquities people to go through the dirt and make sure there's no artifacts there. Well, they were doing that in the old city of Jerusalem, and they found a shard of pottery that had an inscription about King David, and it comes from about 1000 BC. Proof, of course, that King David actually lived, which those of us in the faith already believed. Okay, why am I telling you this? Because there is a little inscription that they found online, and it's called, let me get the word right here, the Deir Allah inscription. And it comes from a place in Jordan from about 825 BC, something like that. And it references Balaam, son of Beor. So this man was this ancient sorcerer, well known in the ancient world, so that he's even mentioned outside of the Bible. Boom! Isn't that awesome? That makes me so excited. I just love stuff like that. It's just so cool. Okay, so here we are. This is the closing part of Numbers, and there's a little bit of a mystery here which I want to explain to you. Like Miss Marple. That's an Agatha Christie reference that will bring all the young people in, hearing Agatha Christie references. Okay, so we have here in Numbers 22 where the king wants to get at them. This is 22:3. And Moab was in great dread of the people, Exodus 9 language, because they were many. Moab was overcome with fear. And so Moab said to the elders of Midian, let's go ahead and try to fight them. Let's hire, the king, his name is Balak. Let's hire Balaam. So they try to hire Balaam. And this weird thing happens where God thwarts Balaam from cursing Israel. And in fact, Balaam ends up having to bless them. So what you have in Numbers chapters 23 and 24, 25, 26, is all these beautiful poems from Balaam. Balaam's been hired to curse Israel. He ends up actually talking about how there's going to be a Messiah to come from Israel one day. That's what those oracles are about. So it's It's like Genesis 50:20. Remember, Joseph says, what you intended for evil, God has used for good. So they want to use Balaam to curse Israel, and he ends up blessing Israel and giving these amazing messianic oracles. Okay. Well, then it kind of looks like Balaam gets in a little bit of trouble. Why is that? What happens? Well, there's this little verse in Numbers 31. So in the intervening chapters, the Israelite men start lusting after the Midianite women, and they start worshiping the Midianite gods, and it causes this real problem in Israel, this problem of idolatry. And then the story moves on, and then Moses wants them to fight the people of Midian. This is Numbers 31. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, avenge the people of Israel on the Midianites, and then you're going to die. So Moses spoke to the people. He said, arm them. Let's go to Midian, and we'll fight against them. So they go to war. They fight against the Midian. Verse 8, Numbers 31, verse 8. They killed the kings of Midian with the rest of their slain. Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba, the 5 kings of Midian. And they also killed Balaam, the son of Beor, with the sword. And you're thinking, why Balaam? What did he do? The last we had seen of Balaam, he had been hired to curse. He doesn't take the money. He doesn't do it. Now, did you see this? This is later on in the passage. This is Numbers 31:15. Moses is mad after the battle. He says, and you let all the women live? Behold, these, on Balaam's advice, caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord. And so the plague came upon them. And you go, whoa, that wasn't in there. It wasn't. This is how the Bible likes to work, right? You learn a thing later that makes sense of a thing you read earlier. It's why you got to read the Bible over and over and over. Okay, so now we learn that Balaam was behind the idea that sent all these women into the Israelite camp to kind of ensnare the men. So the king of Moab, he's trying to hire Balaam to curse. Balaam can't curse. His donkey gets in the way. It's not possible. End of the story. But then it looks like that later on, Balaam went back to that king and said, actually, I wouldn't mind having some of that money. Why don't you pay me? Here's the idea. Send the women in. The women will get the men to go after the foreign gods, and then we're going to attack them. And ultimately, that's what gets Balaam in trouble. Okay, here's what's cool. This is the Old Testament. Well, there's a Jewish writer from the time of Jesus, a little bit after Jesus, the generation after Jesus, named Josephus. And he writes for the Romans this long history of the Jewish people, and he comments on this passage. And so what Josephus, who's writing at the time of Jesus, does is that he shows us how the Jews interpreted this passage. And Josephus puts a speech into Balaam's mouth where he goes to the king and he says, well, I haven't been able to curse. God has stopped me. But here's another idea. Give me money and I'll do it. And that's how we get this scenario that we have here in Numbers 31. So what I'm telling you is that this is a great example of how over time the Jews were thinking about this. What could have happened? Why did Balaam get involved? And that's what they came up with. And then finally, if you turn to the little tiny New Testament letter of Jude, it's like one little page, one little short thing. Jude references Balaam in one verse. He says, verse 11 of Jude, woe to them, for they walked in the way of Cain and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error and perished in Korah's rebellion. He's drawing on these Old Testament stories. He's talking about some false teachers in the New Testament times. And he says, Balaam was interested in financial gain. So that explains what happened to Balaam. He's doing great. He seems to be doing a pretty good thing. He's not working against God's people. In fact, he pronounces blessing upon them. But later on, the love of money ensnared him, and he circles back, and he has to get him caught up in his own sin, and he's killed in Numbers 31. I thought that was interesting. There's a lot more numbers we don't have time to look into, including the strange passage of the bronze serpents on the poles. The very thing that was meant to bring death is a way of bringing life. Mysterious passage. We'll maybe look at that in a future week. What I thought we'd do now as we wrap up is just look at a question that came up a couple of times this last week from the Gospel of Mark. Okay, so here's our question of the week. A couple of different people asked it. It's about Mark 14:51. Mark 14:51. This is in the Passion account. When Jesus is taken in the Garden of Gethsemane, how do you say that? Gethsemane. Okay, here we go. Mark 14:51. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. What? Why is that even in there? Whoa, this is very interesting. Now, in the oldest manuscripts we have, in fact, we have no manuscripts without what I'm about to say. In all of the manuscripts of the Gospels we have, they all include the titles. The Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John. So from the earliest days, they were circulated with the name of this person on it. Now, by tradition, the Gospel of Mark is Peter's preaching, Peter's testimony in Rome. It was the content of Peter's evangelization in Rome among the believers there. And Mark is the man called John Mark, a young man in the book of Acts. In fact, the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Barnabas have a falling out over this little young guy. Paul is tired of him. He won't deal with him anymore, but Barnabas wants to keep him. So that's what Barnabas and Paul split over. So he would have been a young man at the time of the crucifixion. And the best guess is that Mark, who's like Peter's secretary, he's following around Peter, he's writing down Peter's preaching. Mark was there in Jerusalem. He's a Jerusalem person, and he was there. He's a little guy, young guy. Maybe he stayed up late. He wraps himself with this linen cloth real quick. He's following behind the disciples and Jesus. He's scared when the soldiers come. They try to grab him. He lets them take his cloak, and he just runs away naked. And Mark wrote himself into the story there. So that's a good way to think about Mark 14:51. Okay, everybody, party people. That's all I got for you today in this special spring break edition of the Year Through the Bible podcast. Remember, you just got to read. If you are behind, catch up. And don't you dare do that thing where you go, oh, I'm going to catch up. I have to read 4 weeks tomorrow and I'll catch up. Shut up. Just read that day's reading. Catch up if you want. Cut your losses if you want. The main thing is read that day's session and catch up after that. Well, I'm Andrew Forrest. It's the Year Through the Bible. Let's keep going, baby. And I'll see you soon.